No, not at all. When I was really little, I definitely didn't think about going into a career in research. I think I mean, in Canada, the educational system doesn't really give you a lot of insight into what careers in research would be like. But I was in grade 6 or 7, and I had a woman who was a biology teacher, and I loved the class, and then started getting more interested in science and taking more classes in science. And then by the time I got to university, was taking a entirely science-based program. So I think it was really just a natural progression as I became more interested in those classes, and then had the opportunity at university to do some independent work, study projects in a laboratory based setting, and take some courses with laboratory based work. And I really enjoyed that component of the education I was getting, and tried to pursue that further. So I think it was really just one thing led to another. Um, yes and no. I think I've been quite lucky in terms of having mentors, both men and women, who are incredibly supportive of women in science. And um, I think there's obviously limitations for women in science in Canada. I see that in terms of who gets into the more senior leadership positions and that sort of thing. But I think the culture has shifted here a bit in terms of supporting women in science. So it's really wonderful to see that. But I've definitely been in classes or in research settings where I was one of the only women, and definitely one of the only at the time like younger women, and it can be extremely intimidating. Um, Before, I don't think it, because it was, for in my personal experience, limited those experiences. I don't think it deterred me from pursuing that path. But the most salient experiences for me, I would say, is just situations where I've really been the only woman in a class or in a lab or something like that, and that it can be intimidating to find yourself without your typical social circle. Yeah. Um, I think that for me, in terms of specifically with mentorship and finding sponsorship as well as mentorship, it's difficult to find, um, in my experience, women in a senior position to support you as a mentor. And it's hard to see examples of a lot of leadership in women that are kind of exactly what you're looking to do. So I think the challenge is finding an example of someone with a career that you would like to sort of know how they did it. There's not a lot of women that you can look to. So you sort of have to hope that the women that you see in those leadership positions have decided that they're going to share their experiences with other women and support other women. Um, and then I think the other thing is that for mentorship, because there's many more men in research and in leadership roles, it's harder to find mentorship from women if that's something you're looking for. So I think that in particular, in terms of challenges of being a woman, I mean, I'm not aware of situations where I've been um, passed over for someone else, or it's very possible that that's happened, and that those challenges I faced because I'm a woman. But I've been fortunate enough not to think that that's not been a common experience for me. Um, but yeah, I think there's been challenges at times with public speaking engagements or things like that, where you're in a room, and if you're a woman, and especially when you're starting your career and you're a younger woman, I think people don't think you have the same gravitas as your male peers when you're presenting your research and those sorts of things. But my main challenge would be around seeking the right kind of mentorship and sponsorship from women in the field when there is just not that many women at senior positions. Oh, yeah. Well, I just had a baby 3 months ago. So that's going to be something that I'll learn about in the future. And I can absolutely imagine that being very difficult. But in the past, I mean, I've been at liberty to work as much as I wanted to and haven't had to make that compromise yet. Or, I've found that because of the nature of the work that I was doing, I was able to sort of travel a lot, which I really, and the work-life balance hasn't become an issue yet, but I anticipate that becoming a problem in the near future since I just had a child. Yeah, so in terms of the first starting out, what made all the difference for me was choosing the right supervisor. And I think oftentimes, especially women, sort of can grab onto the first opportunity they get because they're extremely thankful for that opportunity and don't take the time to say, I need to find the right opportunity for me. And I can't just latch on to the first thing that comes around if it's not the right fit. Because if you get in a situation, especially with a PhD, which is a really long term commitment, with a supervisor that isn't the right fit for you, that's not a rewarding experience and it's not going to be the right training experience that you want in terms of being able to be independent and have productivity to show as you move into a postdoc. So I think my principal piece of advice would be really be selective and be careful in terms of who you choose as a supervisor. And sometimes that requires balancing the type of work you want to be in, the field you want to be in. Obviously, that can't really change, but specific projects, you need to be working on something that you're extremely passionate about, or a PhD is going to be a really long haul because it is so much work. But really balancing the finding the work that you want to do and finding the right person to do it with, who preferably is in a lab where they've shown to be productive. You Other graduate students in their lab that you could speak to have said that they've had a good experience there, and they feel that it was a good training experience because getting into the wrong situation with the wrong supervisor can obviously just lead to a lot of complications and just not ultimately give you the experience you want. And I think women can sometimes not be as selective as they could be because they think it's so hard to find these positions and I've just found one and maybe my chances of finding another one are not going to be great. And I mean, maybe that could be true, but I do think women sort of owe it to themselves to make sure they find the right fit rather than just making sure they get in the door, because you'll get a lot more out of it. And I think you'll probably be more inclined to stay in science for the long term and really become a strong force for women in science if you have the right training experience from the get-go. Because I think a lot of people leave science because they have bad experiences in their graduate training with supervisors or with the wrong project. And I think that that's really unfortunate because we lose a lot of really great women in science because their training experience isn't good. And I think the more selective we can be in terms of supervisors, and also the more senior people can do to encourage supervisors to be providing the right training experience for their trainees, which is another side of it. But yeah, that would be my biggest thing, is picking the right supervisor. And then um, in terms of later on, I mean, I'm in this sort of phase recently as well, and it is very, very challenging to find positions, especially tenure track or longer term positions in North America. It's becoming extremely difficult. So, I mean, I think the first piece of advice is to unfortunately be tenacious because like anything in science, you have to have a high rejection threshold, I guess. Like you're going to have to get used to applying for grants you don't get, submitting papers that get rejected. Like I think probably more so than a lot of fields, there is a lot of rejection in science, and you have to kind of be okay with that and be confident enough in your work to keep pushing forward. And I think with your career, it has to be a little bit the same way, that you can't let a lot of negatives um, dissuade you if you have the opportunity to keep applying. I understand some people the practicalities of life mean that you have to, find work. But from my experience and the peers that I see around me, the people that end up getting positions, it's because they've just been really relentless about consistently keeping to apply and find, and something comes together. And then also at the time that you're applying, take a really serious look at what gaps you have in your CV, because everybody has them, and find a way to fill them. Whether it's teaching experience, whether it's publication history, whether it's presentations, or even some experience outside of science that might strengthen the leadership on your resume. I think that's something that I had a hard time sort of recognizing where the gaps were in my resume and filling them. So I think that's where mentorship also really comes in a strong way, is that if somebody else who's a mentor to you can take a look at your resume and say, like, these are the gaps that you need to fill, and when you're at an interview, this is probably something that a university could consider a weakness, because other candidates are likely to have a lot of teaching experience or some volunteer experience in the field, or stronger leadership experience, because there's usually ways to fill those gaps, meaningful ways to fill those gaps. And I think that's something that's hard for a lot of people. I mean, it was for me to sort of identify where those gaps were, and start to fill them in.